Hello and welcome to the Foreign Press Center's briefing on the impact of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. My name is Wes Robertson, and I'm the moderator for today's briefing. Our briefers today are Joseph Glauber and David Laborde, both senior research fellows with the International Food Policy Research Institute. And now for the ground rules. This briefing is on the record. The views expressed by the briefers are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of State or the U.S. government. We will post a transcript and video of this briefing later today on our website, which is fpc.state.gov. Please make sure that your Zoom profile has your full name and the media outlet you represent. Our briefers will now give opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. Over to you, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wes. My name is Joe Glauber. I'm a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I'm joined today by David Laborde, who's also a senior research fellow at IFPRI. And we've been doing a lot of work over the past year, certainly tracking what's been going on with the war in Ukraine. And what we thought we would do today is have some brief presentation on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which frankly is kind of a unique agreement in the sense of while a war is going on, there is an agreement here to move grain out of Ukraine. This, of course, has been a big concern since the start of the war, in that Ukraine is a major wheat producer, a major corn producer, and sunflower oil in particular, and that a lot of those exports have been blocked since the start of the war, all the way up through the 1st of August or so, when this agreement went into effect. It was a 180-day agreement. It is scheduled that 180 days will end at the end of this week. And so what we thought we would do is kind of trace what's been happening over the course of the last 180 days. Next slide, Dave. So this chart just shows that over a long over the last 11 months or so, what prices have looked like. And I might add, we've already started from a period where prices were very high and elevated at the beginning of this year. So in January, coming into the season, or coming into the calendar year, we saw wheat and maize prices at the highest levels they had been in several years. Really, you have to go back to 2012-13 or so to see prices that high. And I think the general feeling was that as the new crops started to come in, starting with the wheat crop in the Northern Hemisphere in June, and then with crops coming in, the spring planted crops in the fall, that we would begin to see prices start to come down. Unfortunately, with the war, prices immediately jumped 30, 40, 50% for wheat and about 20% or so for maize, and remained highly elevated until about late May. And they started coming down for a variety of reasons. One, we had very good production response out of other countries. We've seen a number of Russia was able to export wheat. We saw wheat countries like India and Brazil export a lot more wheat than had previously been thought, and a lot of the crops in the Northern Hemisphere, where there had been a lot of concerns, early season concerns about yields, those crops ended up being better than had been expected. And so prices started coming down such that when the deal went into place, they had come down pretty much to pre-war levels. That's about where we've been. Markets are still very much focused on the crops around the world and what sort of yield prospects we see particularly out of the Northern Hemisphere, and now turning to the Southern Hemisphere. But you can see that again, the effect of this agreement, though, has been quite good in the sense of crops have flown throughout, have been able to be shipped out of those Ukraine or the Black Sea ports. Where we did see a blip in prices was when the temporary suspension right around the end of October, early November, where prices went up. Wheat prices went up around 6%. Maize prices went up around 2%. Russia rejoined the agreement a few days later, and then now we're looking. The market now is looking forward to see, what will occur after, whether or not this agreement will be extended. Next slide, David. So here are what actually has been shipped. If you look at the cumulative agricultural exports under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, you can see that there's been a steady shipments. What did happen was that inspections, unfortunately, so the way the agreement works is that grain is exported from Ukraine. It then goes to Turkey, where the ships are under the terms of the agreements. The ships are then inspected and then allowed to move forward. Unfortunately, there was bottlenecks because of the grain that was being exported out of, particularly in the months of September onward, that there was a big backup. That backup has been reduced over the last few weeks, largely because of initially the suspension in the agreement and the fact that now with the agreement scheduled to, unless it's renewed, scheduled to expire at the end of the week, there's been very little activity out of Ukraine ports. Presumably, if the agreement is extended, then we'll see exports pick up again. But that gap of wheat that had been shipped but not yet inspected has now declined substantially. Next slide, David. And this slide just shows what has been exported under the terms of the agreement. And I think you can see that largely two things to note. One is that, yes, if you look at what traditionally was exported, so if you look at what was exported during August through October in 2021, a lot of maize, for example, it went to Europe. Europe has been a traditional market for Ukraine for maize and barley, but you can see that that continued under the initiative. There's still a lot of maize going there, but maize also is being shipped to the MENA countries as well, and you can see in particular with wheat. Some has gone to Europe, but a lot has gone to other areas, traditional recipients of wheat from Ukraine, both through commercial sales and also through humanitarian assistance. So we have some going to, 12% or so going to Africa south of Sahara, which is roughly the same proportion that was going out in 2021. And so I think that generally you're seeing volumes at least the destinations looking very, very similar to what it was in 2021, but the volumes are down considerably. And I think that's still a concern that Ukraine still, while this has really helped boost exports out of Ukraine, they still have well below the pace that they've seen in recent years. And frankly, in some of the big months, harvest or shipping months in the fall, they can be shipping anywhere from 5 to 6.5 or so million tons a month, and that's down considerably from what we see right now. So I think that's still a concern. What the problem for Ukraine is the fact that because they were unable to ship as much wheat as they typically would during the course of a regular season, that means that storage capacity has been hampered. And they're essentially are now resorting to temporary storage bags. What that meant for prices is that lowers prices internally. So that means there's disincentives for producers, particularly with high input costs for fertilizer and energy and other inputs. That means that there's just strong disincentives to plant. And we already see that fall plantings for wheat this year are down considerably, at least according to the Ukraine Ministry of Agriculture. And frankly, what that does is push this tight grain situation into next year by virtue of the fact that a country that accounts for about 10% of world exports in wheat and a similar percentages for maize and some 50% of vegetable oils in terms of sunflower oil. That means that we'll see less of that next year as well. And so those the supplies will have to be made up in the world market. or we would see continued high prices. Next slide. This is just to conclude with the fact that we have written a lot on Ukraine and with several blogs there. And I think in the chat, you'll see some other additional or see some links there as well. But we're more than happy to take questions, and I'll stop there, Wes, and listen.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the presentation. We'll now move into the Q&A portion. If you have a question, please go to the participant field and virtually raise your hand. We will call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. You can also submit questions in the chat box. If you've not already done so, please take the time now to rename your Zoom profile with your full name and the name of your media outlet. I don't see any hands raised yet, but we did have some advanced questions. The first I'll read off is from Yasuki Hirata from Sankei Newspaper, Japan. He asks, Russia claims grains are not exported to developing countries. What do you think about that?
Well, thanks. I'm going to let David Laborde, my colleague, address the first question. David?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for the question. As Joe has already shown you in one of the slides, I think that what we have seen in the export pattern, so where these products are going to under the agreement is exactly what we were expecting, meaning that the main markets are supply. First of all, Turkey. I think that Turkey is a very large importer of this product, as it's usually the case. Then you have Europe for some animal feed. Then you have Egypt for wheat, but also for corn, for their own livestock industry. And you will see basically this pattern coming from high-income countries up to the very low-income countries with humanitarian shipment from the WFP going to Yemen and or other country situations. So the message here is that the outcome of the deal is not biased. It reopened the ports of Ukraine to export, and Ukraine export where it's used to export to, and it really depends on the product. So of course, maize, and Ukraine has a lot of maize, it goes mainly to economies that have a need for maize and the livestock sector, from the Middle East up to Spain, but also to East Asia, including China for some of the feed products, when the wheat go to North Africa and to some sub-Saharan African countries, or in the Middle East, either Iran or Yemen. So what we see is a bit back to normal. And of course, large economy may buy more, but that once again, it's just letting trade take place again. The last point I want to make is, to some extent, that doesn't even matter so much, because what matters is that the country that want to buy grain buy their grains and do not start to go to other places to find grain that will push price up. Meaning that, for instance, if you were in Spain before and you were not able to get your maize from Ukraine, then you start to buy more maize from South America, and that you start to compete with Morocco, then you start to compete with Nigeria. So really what is important is to get back these crops on regional and global markets to limit the pressure on prices. And that's what the deal has done, even if the total volume are still not what they should be compared to the past.
Thank you. I do see that we have a hand raised. It's Alex Rafulo from Toronto News. Alex, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Wes, thank you so much for doing this. And Joe and David, thank you so much for a very compelling presentation. And my name is Alex Rafulo. I represent Azerbaijan's independent news agency, Turan. A couple of questions here. As you said, the world is facing unprecedented hunger. To put this into numbers, how many millions of people are estimated to be marching towards starvation? at this point? And also, can you give us a few instances to the BSGI is working? And must be allowed to continue, of course, working. I spoke with farmers in my region a couple of days ago, and one of them mentioned that estimated that price he paid for grain had dropped somewhere between 20-25%, since the blockade was lifted. If that's is that your observation as well, or if you or do you have different numbers? And lastly, not to play the advocate of the devil's role, but Russia keeps saying that the issue of expanding or the grain deal has not been yet been resolved. Do you have any idea of what they are talking about? Again, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, I'm going to start with answering a couple of the questions. I'll let David come in again. I think these are great questions. In terms of the price impacts of the deal, I think this recent action of the suspension of the deal probably gives you a pretty good notion. Roughly 5 to 6%. What we have seen the prices come down, but they largely came down even before the deal went into place. I want to be cautioned that this is not saying that the deal has very little significance. It has great significance, and I think in particular, insofar as moving into next year is concerned. But it's just to say that prices have come down, but they're still at very high levels. I think if we had had a normal crop season here with no war, with normal crops, that we would have seen prices come down from those January levels even further, much further than what we see right now. So the market's still bearing the weight of the fact that less grain has been able to come onto the market. But I think there's no question this agreement helps that immeasurably. I do think Russia has a lot of, if you read the press reports, what Russia would like is to have some of the adverse effects of sanctions be addressed. I think countries have been a number of countries that have imposed sanctions have been also said that they are exempting from sanctions exports of fertilizer, exports of food, but in fact there have been barriers. And you'll see on our website that was cited, we have just put out a blog last week on sanctions and what the impact of sanctions have been, particularly as affecting fertilizer. And so that's been in the negotiations, at least what I read in the press. David, you may want to comment on the vulnerability issue and.
Yes. So I will also just add on the price story that, prices are seasonal. So I mean that right now in many countries during the fall, harvest takes place. So it has contributed to see these local prices going down in places, but also on world markets. What we have to keep in mind is normally Ukraine is a big exporter during the late fall and during winter. And that's where actually it's pretty important to see the Ukrainian supply coming on regional market and global market at that time. So for the future of the deal, that's relevant. Now, on the food crisis situation. So as of today, we have more than 200 million people in 45 countries that are what we call severe food insecurity. So people for which it's not only the fact that every day they end their work day with the feeling of hunger, is that where this lack of food starts to be threatening for their lifestyle, their health. And we have basically 5 countries that are nearly in famine situation, covering 500 million people. So yes, we are in a severe situation globally. Now, this has many drivers. As you have said, food prices were increasing before. Many events of last year coming from the consequence of the global COVID crisis to climatic events. And the goal here is not, to start to say, oh, the war in Ukraine is costing this amount of life or creating this amount of hunger. All of these shocks are combined with each other. And as usual, it's the last drop that is going to make the vase or your cup overflow. And that's why we are so cautious about not adding more problem to a situation that is very tense, like the suspension of the deal, like the war. So the more we can go back to normal, the more it will help in a situation where, yes, basically 500,000 people today on Earth are on the verge to die of hunger and famine, and we have 200 million of people that feel hunger so strongly that their health suffer from it, both physical health and mental health. And still, we have more than 800 million people on Earth that have what we call chronic hunger, so in a regular basis, not enough to eat. And all the crises we are dealing with just make things worse.
Thank you so much for those responses. At this point, I don't see additional questions. Do you have, either of you have oh, I do see a question that just came in the chat box. Let me see here. This question is from Amadou Kane from Les Echos Senegal. The question is, you did not mention the African Union mediation on the agreement. Do you think it was really significant?
Yes, I looked at it briefly. I don't know what's going on with the individual, you know, the actual discussions that are ongoing with Turkey and the UN. I do know that many countries, including those countries of the African Union, recognize this as a very key, that is to keep this grain flowing, because again, sub-Saharan Africa benefits, as David mentioned, not just from those countries that do import from Russia and Ukraine, but also in terms of general price levels. So anything that can keep prices lower, everyone's going to benefit. So I think that is a very big political, the will around the world for making this thing work, I think is very, very strong. And so I'm hopeful that we can get an agreement over the next day or so and have, again, ships leaving Ukraine and supplying the rest of the world shortly.
I will add to that I think that the mediation from the African Union is actually a nice move, but not a decisive one, in the sense that Africa is literally between a rock and a hard place in inflation. What they need is basically markets to operate in the Black Sea region to be peaceful, and that both Ukraine and Russia could export. That's what will benefit Africa. But Africa doesn't really have a leverage on any of the player at stake. I think the key player here is really Turkey, because Turkey is between the two worlds. It's a NATO country, but it has also a strong link with Russia. Is importing a lot of grain both from Russia and Ukraine, and it's important for its own economic activities. And so the support from the African Union is noticeable, but Africa is still more, I would say, sometimes used as a token in some discussion than really, listened to from the beginning of the fight.
Let me just say, though, I do think it is very significant, because, you know, oftentimes countries within, particularly with this conflict, are often say, well, we're being asked to choose between two powers, and we really, we'd like to remain neutral in a war, and when it comes to food, I think there's less neutrality. Everyone wants to see more food being shipped. So I think that actually is a very positive thing. And so it again, I think having that sort of pressure on the parties to come to some agreement is quite powerful.
All right. This time I don't see any more questions submitted in the chat box or any hands raised. I don't know if either of you have any final remarks you'd like to make.
Okay. We hope that the deal will be prolonged after November. and that we can go step by step back to normal for the benefit of all consumers of food products around the world, but in particular the more vulnerable, but also the farmers that need to sell their product to prepare the next crops, as Joe has said, because we need to think about the future too.
Yeah, yes, and I would just add that I think unfortunately we're not out of the woods on this. I think this tight supplies are going to be with us for several months and maybe all the way through next year. And so certainly, you know, we're hoping that this deal is extended and moreover that we hope that we see good crops around the world to make up for the deficits, because I think that's going to be the important thing, is ultimately to rebuild global stocks, that we can actually hope that prices will start to come down.
All right, thank you. This concludes our briefing. I want to give special thanks to our briefers for sharing their time with us today. To those of you who participated, thank you and good day.